Hello, I'm Cornell Clayton. I'm the director of the Thomas S. Foley Institute at Washington State University. And on behalf of the Institute, I want to welcome you out to our event today. We put together another exciting series of speakers this semester. That includes a distinguished lecture series which begins next week on the current crisis in American constitutional democracy. The first lecture in that series will be delivered by the renowned American historian Eric Foner from Columbia University. That lecture will be next Tuesday at noon. That's February 16th. So I encourage you to put that on your calendars. I want to thank the College of Arts and Sciences for its continued support of the Foley Institute and its programs. You can learn more about our upcoming events and about other Foley programs by subscribing to our YouTube station, liking us on Facebook, or emailing us at tsfoley@wsu.edu. So today's event focuses on free speech and regulation of the internet. In the wake of the insurrection at the US Capitol on January 6th, Twitter, Facebook, and other social media platforms permanently removed Donald Trump's accounts for violating their policies regarding the posting of false and inflammatory information. In response, some conservative and libertarian groups denounced this deplatforming of President Trump, as well as other groups such as QAnon and white supremacist groups. As they argue this was politically biased censorship by big tech elites. Many others, however, have argued that these social media corporations have failed to address the malignant spread of false, hateful, and incendiary messaging, and that it's time now for government to play a more robust role in policing internet speech. Currently, Section 230 of the 1996 Communications Decency Act protects social media companies from liability for the content posted by their users. But this law is now under increasing scrutiny from both Democrats and Republicans who would like to see it changed. So how should we think about speech on the internet? What role should private companies have in policing speech on their platforms? Should government remove the protections of Section 230 and treat social media more like other types of print and broadcast media? Well, to help us think through some of these important questions and to place this current controversy into a broader historical context, we are fortunate to have with us today Margaret O'Mara, who's a professor of history at the University of Washington. Professor O'Mara teaches courses in the political and economic history of the modern United States. Her research focuses specifically on the connection between high-tech industries and American politics. Among her many publications is her latest book, The Code, Silicon Valley and the Remaking of America, published by Penguin Press in 2019. She's also the author of Pivotal Tuesdays, published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2015, and Cities of Knowledge, published by Princeton University Press in 2005. Dr. O'Mara is a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times as well. Professor O'Mara is going to speak for about 20 to 30 minutes, after which we'll have some time for some questions and discussion. If you have questions, I encourage you to email those to me at tsfoley@wsu.edu. Again, that's tsfoley as in Tom S. Foley at wsu.edu. So Margaret, I'm going to turn the time over to you now, and I'll be back at the end of your presentation with some questions from our audience.
Great. Thank you so much, Cornell, for having me. Thank you to everyone out there in the audience. I'm really delighted to be here. So I'm going to speak to you and also share my screen and have some slides. So let's get started. So I'm a historian, and I'm a historian of public policy and business and the intersections between the two. So what I wanted to do today was to talk about the regulatory environment today by giving us the story of how we got to now and this larger landscape of why we have the regulations that we do or the absence thereof when it comes to internet companies, social platforms, and others, and how that's really important in understanding and determining what the next steps might be, what really smart, thoughtful, wise approaches to this question of speech on the internet, what that is, how it's being classified and regulated, and who gets to say it and where. So I'm diving deep here. I told you I was going to go back in time. And back to the beginning of the digital age, where here's a shot from election night 1952. That was Dwight Eisenhower versus Adlai Stevenson. And this is the first time that a all-digital computer made an appearance on network television. It was a gimmick put together by CBS News executives as a way to, in part, promote their election night coverage, which then featured their brand new anchor, Walter Cronkite. So he is here. He is appearing with the Univac, which was one of the earliest commercially available digital computers. And long story short, the Univac made a very early call, even before the West Coast polls had closed, that Eisenhower was going to win in a landslide. It was so decisive that no one really believed that that was accurate, including the people at Univac. And so they kind of hedged a bit, and turned out Univac was exactly right. But this notion of, thinking what computers how they function as communication devices, as devices that can have a decisive effect on politics, is something that goes all the way back to this earliest moment in the digital age. It's something that's always been there and has been a question tossed around and never fully and satisfactorily resolved, in part because the technology kept on changing. So this is a little bit of a Washington State hat tip here, but by the time you get to the 1960s, you have the large mainframe machines and their successors, what are called the mini computers, which were not particularly mini, they were the size of refrigerators. But you also have the beginning of computer networking and communication by computer, including teletype machines that are in high school computer labs. There weren't very many of them. There was one set up at Lakeside School, the private school attended by, yes, this is indeed Paul Allen and Bill Gates. I think Mr. Gates is in 9th grade in this picture, although he looks a little younger. But these young computer enthusiasts get access to computers through networking. And about this time is when the US government, the FCC, is starting to kind of talk about this question of, well, what sort of communication is this? Do we regulate this like we do other forms of media? Is this like AT&T? AT&T was very not interested in having competitors be in charge of computer communication, was very interested in making that part of Ma Bell as well. The FCC said no. And in some ways, in a series of computer inquiries over the 60s and into the 70s, it kind of kicked the can down the road. But what is notable is what it decided not to do, which is to regulate computer communication in the same way that the telephone was a regulated monopoly, telephone service. And also made it clear that AT&T could not monopolize that type of communication in the way it didn't get to have computers as well as other regular telephony. So this sort of decision not to regulate or not to create what at the time was called a computer utility, using networked computers. Again, there are no personal computers here. The people do not have computers in their homes. The fact that Gates and Allen had this in their high school is very rare. There were college computer labs, but this was not something that was a common feature. But there was a recognition that this was the future, that communication by computer, getting news by computer, sending mail back and forth, that this was where things could go, and that the technology was going in that direction. So as we go so far back as to the Johnson administration, where there are discussions about how to regulate this emerging computer networking. At the time, the internet is created in 1969, but this is not the network that President Johnson's administration is talking or thinking about. The FCC is not talking or thinking about this. This is the internet before the internet, what was called time sharing, where you had a mainframe or a mini computer in one place, and then connected by phone lines, you had remote terminals that were kind of dumb terminals that had keyboards, and you could input information, and then the calculations would be completed over in the main with the main machine and then spit back out to you. It was a very different sort of thing than what we would imagine right now. The other thing that is happening in parallel, and this is significant, I think, to our backstory, is an ongoing debate in Congress about computer privacy. Yeah, computer privacy. Gathering too much data about individuals and using it perhaps against their will for in ways that they don't expect. Yeah, that. This is something that was the subject of nearly 100 pieces of legislation introduced in Congress between the mid-60s and the mid-70s. And in contrast to the privacy debates of right now, which very much focus on private companies, the focus then was on public entities, on government agencies that were using electronic data processing, mainframes, to process information for all sorts of things, everything from Social Security Administration to the domestic programs of the Great Society to the Pentagon, Selective Service Administration, to all sorts of things. So this whole kind of federal ecosystem of information gathering is something that federal lawmakers are starting to look at and be concerned about. And there was a lot of public conversation and magazine covers and editorials about the big brother computer. And the government was very much the target of this. Keep in mind, this is what's going on at the same time. This is the era of Vietnam. This is the era of Watergate. And yes, speaking of Watergate, this clip here from the New York Times, 1971, is a shot of none other than Sam Ervin, this North Carolina senator who was the chair of the Senate Watergate Committee. That's probably why you might recognize his face. At the same time, and a few years earlier, he was a leading advocate for a national privacy law that culminated in the passage of the 1974 Privacy Act, which is still kind of our landmark modern privacy act. It essentially gives individuals the right to know what the government knows about them. So it's a transparency measure rather than a data collection measure, and I think that's quite significant. Another significant thing about the Privacy Act of 1974, which is really, of all that flurry of legislation, only a few actual laws came out of it, and that is one of them. The Privacy Act of 1974 is focused on government computers, not on private sector information gathering. And in part because it was a different information landscape then. It didn't mean that private sector companies weren't gathering data by computer about individuals. They were, but the political focus at the moment was on these databases that really Congress could control and that could dictate what they did and what they gathered. So, and there was a real reluctance, a growing reluctance by the time this is signed in late 1974 by President Gerald Ford, who's just become president after the resignation of Richard Nixon, to regulate business, to kind of limit what business can do in terms of gathering, marketing to people and some fundamental business operations. So that's kind of how we, that's just as not choosing to have a computer utility sets the US on one path, a path that ultimately creates this runway for what becomes the commercial internet. Having a privacy law that's focused on, that's very much responding to the Watergate Vietnam moment of suspicion about government information gathering, for which there was a lot of good reason to be suspicious, and concerns about enlarging bureaucracy generally, that there's the privacy laws we do have are focused on one thing and not another, and they aren't about preventing the collection of information in the first place, which is quite significant. So, at the same time all this is going on, people who probably think they have very little in common with people like Sam Ervin, the Vietnam generation, long-haired college students who are coming out of places like Berkeley and Stanford in the late 60s and early 70s, are starting to experiment with new types of computer networks and thinking about how computer networks can connect people and become these means of communication that are basically predicated on this notion that information should be free, that no one should be censoring what others are saying, that everyone should have a voice, that actually having this free flow of information is a really important precept in resolving some of the great inequities in society. That if you're talking through a computer, you're not thinking about, you're not as limited by geography or by socioeconomic difference, racial difference. It's a very idealistic, techno-optimistic vision, but it's one that propels Silicon Valley companies and tech companies generally from the 1970s forward, this idea that the computer itself is a liberating device that can change your world and change the way you communicate. So by the time we get to the 1980s, we have the PC revolution, desktop computers on many desks, both office and home, and the emergence of new phone system-based networks, dial-up modems, remember those, like CompuServe and Prodigy. And they are networks where you can, you go on, you can send email, you can get news. It's, again, the internet before the internet. And it's something that is becomes a very popular commercial product. It's the beginning of the first online communities, these bulletin board services where people would come together around a common interest or a common political interest. And so there's a whole range of things, people who, from everything from people who like to knit to people who like to code to people who all subscribe to particular political party or political belief system. It's a whole host of things that are sort of starting to emerge in the 80s, even before, but it's still pretty small. There are not that many people who are active parts of these communities, and still where information is disseminated, and certainly where political information and political speech is happening, is in these traditional media, newspapers, magazines, broadcast television. You still have through the end of the 1980s, the Fairness Doctrine, which regulates political speech on television and radio broadcast networks, saying that you have to give, if you're going to let someone give their point of view, you need to have the other side have equal time. And so this is a modulating function. It's a pretty stringent regulation on what these private companies can broadcast, but it is a modulating function that really creates a great disincentive for networks to skew strongly in one direction or another. So this brings us to where you think I should have started the story all along, or maybe what you were expecting, which is the 1990s. But this prehistory is really important in understanding how we get to the set of the policy choices and the set of laws that are set in place in the 1990s that are shaping our internet environment today. And things like Section 230 that have gone from being this obscure thing that only a few people knew about to something that's now a commonplace term that many people are familiar with, even if they don't quite understand its full history and scope. So 1990s is when the internet, which up until that time had been a government run and controlled network that was largely open only to military and their contractors, including academic contractors. So people in academic computing labs were really the first users and also creators of the internet. So they could use their computers to talk to one another across the internet. And it gradually becomes opened up to other users, but not allowed, no commercial activity is allowed in the 1980s. And then in the 90s, the US government opens it up to commercial activity. You can buy and sell things on the internet. So then that changes the whole value proposition. The other thing that changes everything is that the internet goes from being something that you have to know how to, you have to be a programmer to use, essentially. You have to understand how to navigate it. It wasn't very user-friendly. It goes from being that to being something that ordinary mortals can use. And those vehicles are first the World Wide Web, which is a kind of way, Tim Berners-Lee's creation of 1989, which is this notion of kind of finding a hierarchical way to organize the information on the internet and make it kind of all connected to one another. I'm oversimplifying, but it sort of lays on top of the backbone of the internet itself. And then on top of that, the Mosaic browser, which is then commercialized as Netscape in 1994. Which again is the product of a bunch of graduate students in a computer lab at the University of Illinois. And they moved to Silicon Valley and turned it into a company. So a browser makes the internet now accessible to ordinary people. You can go and point and click, and it's something that's navigable in the way that the personal computer makes computing navigable to people who don't know how to, don't know how to code, don't know how to build apps. It makes it more accessible. And so this prompts an explosion that's really encouraged by lawmakers of the 1990s. Significantly, Vice President Al Gore was, when he was Senator Al Gore, a major sponsor of the legislation that effectively enabled the backbone of the internet to be strengthened enough so then it could in turn be commercialized. So while Al Gore didn't invent the internet, nor did he actually claim to, but he was, I think, deserves credit for being one of the few people in Congress in Washington during that time who really was grasping the need to have this really robust infrastructure and what the commercial potential could be, and creating a runway for that commercial potential to be realized. And so Bill Clinton and Al Gore were very, very rah Silicon Valley. They saw these internet companies as these sort of extraordinary opportunities to a new chance to bring information to all sorts of people. Again, kind of going back to this 1970s idealism about, the computer on a desk connected to other computers can erase inequities in education, for example. Or, internet access can open up all sorts of possibilities that the real world can't allow. And we still have a great deal of that idealism running through the public policy conversation. And for good reason. The internet has opened up this world of information. It has brought out the best in us and the worst in us in many ways. But that policy moment it's really important to sort of understand kind of how and why the internet companies become so effectively privileged by the regulatory environment, kind of created, they are very, you have lawmakers, not just Democrats like Clinton and Gore, but also Republicans like Newt Gingrich, who, like Gore in the 1980s, is one of the few people in Congress who was really getting that this was going to be transformative and working to find ways to make help the industry grow. So, and after the 1994 midterms, of course, the Republicans take control of both the House and the Senate. Gingrich is Speaker. So coming in just as the internet is taking off, the dot-com boom is taking off, you have Washington lawmakers on both sides of the aisle who are very invested and very interested in nurturing this industry and are, willing to listen to what the leaders of that industry are saying about, let us regulate ourselves, don't regulate us when we're so small, let us grow and let information be free. So this gets us to the backstory that leads to the sort of transformative reform, the Telecom Act of 1996, which fittingly was signed into law 25 years ago this week, of which Section 230 is a part. And the backstory for how Section 230 comes to be is actually something that has to do with these old networks, the internet before the internet, that then by the 1990s are using the internet. It's a lawsuit against Prodigy. There was also lawsuits brought against CompuServe, other big providers, that for content that had been on their platforms that other people had put there. And this was seen as, certainly with these emerging internet platforms and companies, we didn't have social media networks yet. This is, 1995, Mark Zuckerberg was 10. So this is a very different world of computer networking and communication. And where the news is being broken is in the print newspaper. There is no online New York Times. It's a very, very different world. But this is the trigger for Washington lawmakers really wanting to create something so this doesn't happen again. So you don't have these platforms being held liable for what others are putting on them. Information can't be free if you are a platform that is now responsible for every single thing, every single post, every single comment that's placed on you. And a lot of people had an interest in seeing this happen, like having some sort of protection here, including newspapers that, wanted to go online and have users post comments. There's a lot of, it isn't just these .com companies and these internet companies, but certainly the excitement about the potential of Silicon Valley and this belief that a free flow of information on the internet was inherently a good thing was the backstory to this legislation. But there's another thing going on too at the same time, which is why when we talk about Section 230, it's talked about as Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which is the part of the official name of the Telecom Reform Act of 1996. And that is because in the early days of the internet, one of the major things it was used for was pornography. And there was a great deal of media coverage about, this is a famous Time magazine cover, cyber porn. And the real worry was not simply that pornography existed, although that was of concern to quite a few, but particularly that children could so easily just go on their family computer and tap into all sorts of things, and that there were no restraints on it. And so trying to contain that smut on the internet was another motivating factor in shaping the Telecom Act of 1996. And Section 230 is that's why you have this nomenclature. But I think even though Section 230 is not about necessarily pornography, I think that is a useful backdrop to understand why it reads the way it does, what it's for, what it was intended to do, and what the political context was for its passage. A lot of the other provisions of the Communications Decency Act itself were thrown out as unconstitutional. They were the initial law passed was pretty restrictive and was really, again, very alarmed about how pornography could be curtailed and how children could be protected from seeing it. But the one piece that held was Section 230. So the Telecom Act is signed in February 8th, 1996 in the Library of Congress, very symbolic. Clinton signs it with an electronic pen. So it's all weighted with symbolism of kind of the whole world's storehouse of information was now going to be available through this electronic devices in your home. It was, again, the techno-optimism that had fueled Silicon Valley since the 1970s is still fueling the construction and the execution of this law, which really changes the broader telecom landscape and communications landscape. It's not just internet, it's this whole new world, but it really opens things up and creates a space for Silicon Valley-based and Seattle-based companies to grow and grow very large. So less than a decade after that, you have the dot-com boom, you have the dot-com bust, and then you have a new generation of companies that are coming out of that bust that are doing entirely new things, including social media. And so social media companies, Facebook's founded in 2004, Twitter 2006. This is the heyday of blogging. This is the year that Time magazine decides its person of the year is you, because the internet is all about personal expression and user created content. And this was, again, a very optimistic moment that continues for some time, that this is going to connect people. Connecting the world is inherently good, that this free flow of information is going to be good, and that these companies are going to, Section 230 allows these companies to moderate their platforms. It's essentially a self-regulatory device. They're not held liable. They don't get sued like Prodigy did back in 1995. They can do what they want, but the way it's been interpreted, because this collides with this very deeply ingrained Silicon Valley ideology, and it's, again, ingrained in this 1970s moment, that transparency and not taking sides and letting all voices be heard and let 1,000 or 1,000,000 or 2 billion flowers bloom has led to a really, really light touch when it comes to content moderation. And thus, when content moderation has happened in a kind of post hoc reactive fashion, it has been, well, first of all, it's a game of whack-a-mole, which I can talk more about in the questions after. I think the scope and the scale of this is, far beyond the idea of kind of a human content moderation mechanism doing something truly effective about it. But it is just underscores how different a world the internet world was when the laws that enable it were set into place. So when we get to the events of January 6th, which are the subject of the impeachment trial in the Senate that's continuing today, where you have social media front and center in that, as Cornell said in his introduction, you have, the reaction to that is the thing that boots then President Trump off Twitter. But also so much of that, this revolution was not televised. It was broadcast on social media and on multiple platforms. And that evidence from the day by the people who participated is being used in the trial right now and being put into the permanent record of the Congress. So it's again, who in 1996, 25 long years ago, who could have imagined back in 1952 when Walter Cronkite and the UNIVAC were hanging out predicting the presidential election that we would get here in 2021? And it sort of underscores how there is a current mismatch, a regulatory mismatch, where the laws of one generation have not, how could they have known? I think that in the 1990s, while the cyber porn scare was a little bit overwrought, particularly when we look back on it now, but it did respond to very, very legitimate concerns, and also the regulatory roadmap that came out of the 90s created rules of the road that really worked, that allowed these companies, this industry to grow, to allow these products and platforms to become part of our lives. And, we wouldn't be having this seminar this way if perhaps there'd been a different regulatory environment. That does not mean that you just, okay, all good, keep on going as we going, because we're now seeing the faults of the system that has not kept up or is not able to respond to the reality of the way that social media in particular is being used. So this is the slide that maybe I should put at the end of every single talk I give, which is that everything has a history, that Section 230 has its 25-year legislative history, but it really goes back to these bigger, longer trend lines and understanding how we got to right now. And I will leave it at that. Thank you all very much.
All right, thanks a lot. I like that last slide. Everything. And I'm tempted to ask you why all these tech CEOs don't wear shoes after seeing some of them.
It is a theme, isn't it? I know. I could do a whole deck of just barefoot. I didn't even put Steve Jobs in there with all of his many barefoot shots. It's a thing. And I actually think Steve Jobs started it. I think it's a callback. It's a throwback to if you're truly a brilliant iconoclastic tech entrepreneur, you do not wear shoes. At least when the magazine comes to photograph you.
I won't tell you I'm in stocking feet here right now. So.
Oh, okay. All right.
So let me start with a question that's in the minds of many people. And that is the question about censorship. Mm-hmm. When social media companies try to start policing their own standards, there are some folks, especially on the right today, who think that they disproportionately censor or remove posts from conservatives. So there's a bias in the policing. So that's my first question. Is there really, do we know whether there's a bias or not? What does the evidence show? My second question is, should we think of that as presenting a First Amendment question at all? Since the First Amendment only applies to government, mm-hmm. not to private companies. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, we can think about social media as a modern day public square in lots of ways. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So what do you think?
It's a really good question. It's a really sticky one. I mean, sort of what gets to the heart of it is that it is a public square, but it was not designed to be one. It was designed to sell ads on the internet. And it also has made so much money by the algorithm, right, which essentially manipulates the feed to deliver news to you that you think that will get you to stay on that site the most. And that information is what engages us is there things that tap into our emotions. And that may be cute kittens or kitty Zoom filters or things that make us laugh, but also things that make us enraged. Engagement and enragement have a close correlation. And so it has, I think what has happened is that it has privileged the loudest voices in the room. So part of this is just there's such a fire hose of information. There's too much information for the brain to process. So the algorithmic amplification or algorithmic sorting is partially kind of a machine curating for us based on what we users' eyeballs have touched and liked before, and what our friends' eyeballs have touched and liked before. So it's a whole kind of web, a very sophisticated web of information. I should say these companies have set out to be, they are so successful at what they set out to do, kind of beyond their wildest dreams. I kind of sometimes feel like, Mark Zuckerberg, kind of a picture him with an engineer's cap as like running a runaway train and not knowing how to stop it. Although I don't know, sometimes I wonder how hard he's trying. But there are also companies that are beholden to shareholders and beholden to, not beholden to kind of keeping a healthy conversation, as Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Twitter, calls it. So, is there censorship of particular voices? I wouldn't say no. I would say I don't think so. I think what we're seeing is incendiary, enraging speech on the edges has both been engaging, as very engaging, and has been something that has been, easily can be incendiary. And then we're seeing the consequence of kind of a total hands-off approach, like let 2 million flowers bloom, and then a post hoc kind of trying to come in with some human content moderation and some rules. When you have this sort of, again, it becomes a game of whack-a-mole. But I think there are voices, the voices that have been, conservative voices have used, not all conservative, but some conservative voices and figures have used platforms like Facebook so effectively. President Trump used Twitter so effectively, and his campaign and his team used Facebook incredibly effectively, and sort of figured out how to work it and how to kind of play to this engagement, enragement metric, which was very successful. But it also is, that is the problem. I mean, part of the problem is the way that these platforms are made and what their business model is. And they're, and they weren't designed to do what they're doing now. and there's a mismatch there.
Yeah. So Griffin Grubb asked a question about whether or not regulation of the internet should include the privacy protections for individuals about the information that they share on these platforms. And if so, what would that kind of legislation look like to be effective?
Yeah, I mean, these are moments when I'm really glad I'm not a policymaker and I'm just a historian who gets to say, here's the problem. But I do think that where we have what's problematic, the state of what's problematic right now is that the extent of data collection and the fact that it's not visible. So there is a data transparency problem that the GDPR, the European law, is designed to mitigate. But there's a bigger kind of data portability question about, so one of the reasons, say, we keep on using a particular network, whatever your chosen social network is, you stay on even though you're ambivalent about the broader effect of what it's doing, because all your friends are on there and you have like established relationships, and in many cases business relationships, professional relationships, or you have a small business and you have a Facebook storefront. So how can you make that data and that identity portable and that network portable, and rather than being tied to one entity? And I think that's a fair thing to think about when you do have certain platforms so dominant, becoming such dominant forms of communication that it's very hard to opt out fully. But I think that there's, I think about, on one hand, we can look to regulation of other private media, which has been a combination of industry standards, sort of journalistic standards and practices, and regulatory guardrails as one potential model. And of course, all tech companies are not the same. Like when we talk about big tech, it's kind of a fallacy because usually it's 5 companies that have wildly different business models. But for the ad-based business model that's of Google and Facebook, that's most of their money, you could think about creating, a tax on data, or more kind of just creating disincentives for wide open, gather everything you can and micro-target. Ending targeted ads. I don't like advertising, like since the 19-teens has been targeted. Advertising's always been targeted. So that's I think that's a slippery slope, but there is, the degree to which it has been so micro-targeted and it's automated. has been, again, the secret of their success and the secret of why there's been such successful profit generating companies. But that is, I think there are ways you can disincent that. You can look to the regulation of other industries, which, by the way, have continued to make a lot of money. And I also, just as another note on this, I don't think antitrust is a different hammer. It's a different nail, different hammer and nail than privacy per se. Those are two different things. So the kind of break them up answer is a limited utility with different problems.
Yeah, I wonder. So let me just follow up on it. I wonder if you use taxes, for instance, as a disincentive to gathering of private information.
Yeah.
What that does to the financial model and the accessibility question. Does it? Because obviously, then that makes it expensive to provide these services, and people pay, right?
So yeah, because that's the alternative model of content provision on the internet, which we see with newspapers. You have to you have a paywall, right? You have to subscribe. You want to see read the local paper or the New York Times. You have to hit a paywall after a certain point, and you could do that with social media. I mean, we've been paying we get it for free because we pay with our data. We get these free, we get Gmail, we get these free software services because we pay with our own data, and making it subscription that's a barrier. And that is something that is, again, antithetical to this deeper belief system that, information should be open and it's something that's not just held by the companies themselves, but something that a lot of policymakers have really promoted over time. But it does seem like, we have so much, we're drowning in so much information. It's very hard to make sense of it. And I think, we have a problem of disinformation, but I think it's also just too much information. It is very hard for, a student at WSU who wants to really get smart on a particular issue, even if they're really savvy and very kind of wary about disinformation and going to good sources and all those things. It's still, because there's so much out there, it's made these open-ended research projects, right? Like my students will be writing research papers and they're like, I could just keep on going forever because it's this bottomless noodle bowl of information. And at some point, I think that's one of the things that we historians do. We kind of turn all this information into a story or to a narrative arc to try and make sense of it. And, that could be a way I'm going to be interested to see where the industry goes and kind of where the consumer imperatives go and consumer preferences go to more sort of a more walled garden approach, which again can keep people from kind of talking to people from different across the aisle. But right now in these giant information ecosystems, we're having a very hard time doing that anyway.
Yeah. So that last question, I apologize, was actually from Connor Simmons, but I now have a question from Griffin. He asks about your thoughts on the deplatforming of Parler. And is there a difference between media companies removing a particular tweet or a particular post versus removing an account versus deplatforming an entire social media network, right?
Yeah.
With Parler. Is there a difference between these, and should we think about them differently in policy terms?
Yeah, well, I think, look, the deplatforming of Parler, which is affected by first Apple and Google taking Parler out of the App Store, and then AWS, Amazon, kicking it off its servers. It's the private market in action. These are all private companies. They can do, Twitter can ban whoever they want. Facebook can do what Section 230 lets them do all this stuff. And these providers, any private sector provider, private provider can, they can do that. But here's the rub that, these are, look, how much of the internet is now run on AWS? Like how much of, if you do have, part of I was listening last weekend to a podcast, GeekWire, the Seattle-based tech publication, has a weekly podcast. And last week they were talking about AWS because Andy Jassy, its head, is now going to be the new CEO. And we're noting that AWS still hosts the National Enquirer, which is the publication that published the racy texts and photos of Jeff Bezos and his girlfriend, and they, they didn't kick them off, which was sort of this ecumenical, but again, they could. So there's the problem is that these companies are so big and they are the place where so much public speech happens that they are, we have privatized so much of things that used to be truly public squares, that now there's a risk of, so where do you go? What's the alternative? And you have a handful of billionaire tech moguls making a lot of decisions, which I think has been the criticism that has come. It's one of the few places where the left and the right agree in some ways, right? That there's too much power concentrated in too few hands.
So Ali Figgin asks a question about the specific banning of Trump or removal of his accounts. And she asks, given the fact that he had been advocating violence in tweets for some time, including, the Michigan case, for instance, of the Michigan uprising, why didn't they act more quickly to actually remove his accounts?
Yeah. I think there are a couple things going on. There was the January 6th itself was such a shock to the system that it was an assault on the Capitol, which everyone, members of both parties and the vice president seemed to have had close calls. That was kind of broke the dam in terms of a kind of a building concern. And then the other thing, quite frankly, I think there had, the day before, January 5th, Georgia had its special elections, the results of which put the Senate under control of the Democrats, with Kamala Harris as the tiebreaker. And so for social media companies who had been getting a great deal of criticism from Republicans in the House and Senate for alleged censorship and content moderation and taking down accounts and deplatforming people, they saw that was, that there was going to be a new regulatory environment coming ahead, and that they, were not, if the consequences of deplatforming Trump, the political ones, might not have been the same had they done that, if the Senate remained in Republican hands. Now, I don't think that's the only reason, but politics always has, as you all well know, politics is always ever present.
Yeah. So another question for one of our viewers is, do you think that attempts to regulate social media through fact-checking or banning people from platforms or introducing paywalls are all destined to fail? Won't they just push users to different platforms with less regulation? And this viewer's thinking about sites like 4chan or 8chan that attracted and covered quite controversial subjects.
Yeah. Well, look, I think that having more robust content moderation policies within these companies is a good thing. I point to the example of Reddit, which was really, really bad a few years ago. And then they really made some concerted efforts to moderate and clean up some of their more incendiary boards. Now, some of those boards went to 8chan and, kind of went elsewhere, to the questioner's point that, you'll always go somewhere else. I think the difference is that you don't have the ability to, again, it's the walled garden. It's harder to grow that if it is a kind of destructive and incendiary community that's advocating things that are ultimate, that might result in real world violence, for example, that it becomes more contained. But more broadly, I think content moderation, again, the whack-a-mole analogy just is the one that comes to my mind. Like, it's so big. And it's international. I think the other thing too, and this is another real pitfall with these American-led companies that, born on the West Coast of the United States, that are, just with products designed by a very privileged stratum of American society, that are now global products and are, hit in a different way in different regions. And so being able to truly kind of moderate what's happening on those platforms. I think where you start off with more robust policies to begin with, and there's a lot that, Facebook gets, there's a lot that Facebook could do. Another entity that could do a lot more is YouTube, which kind of surprisingly has had, Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google, which is a parent company of YouTube, was hauled before Congress, but most of the scrutiny has been on search and other parts of Google's business. But YouTube has been a radicalizing force. And and it's there are a lot of things that can be done internally, but I think what we know from history, and I spend a lot of time thinking about the 19-teens in 1900s and 19-teens these days, because it was a very similar dynamic. These huge new industries, then it was oil, steel, railroads, et cetera, that had grown up in this unregulated environment that then had a post hoc regulation kind of brought to them because they were the imbalance between public and private interest had become too sharp and too out of whack.
Yeah, I wonder if you've given much thought to actually a new phenomenon, or not new phenomenon, but the impact is different, and that is the use of sites like Reddit for investors to coordinate, right? So we saw this with the GameStop phenomenon, Dogecoin, and others now.
Yeah.
Is that going to? I assume that will bring increased pressures to regulate some of this.
Yeah. Although it's hard, with when the investors are kind of going up against hedge funders and short sellers who aren't really heroic figures. They save the hedge funders. I don't know. I think. It's just it underscores just how much this mediation, especially in the last year, I think it's all become more intensified. I think we'll only fully be able to disentangle that. There will be many dissertations to be written about how much did a kind of 11-month of virtual existence, where so much human in real life existence went away for so many Americans. How did that intensify movements like QAnon, for example? How did that intensify these communities that then spilled into real world violence on January 6th? I think there's a lot of complex causality. I don't think there's a singular, and I think we should resist the urge to say social media is the source of all of our ills. But it's a really, how do we get to the question of regulation? I don't think we should be, one of the things I try to do in my work is show how the government has been part of tech story all along, so that people, I think one of the fears in the industry is that you bring regulation in and the innovative magic is going to go poof, it's all gone. And no, I think there are a number of competitive challenges. The growth of very, very large companies that are able to just acquire younger ones without them getting to grow to become competitors or continue to be competitors is not good for the next generation of innovation. It's a not healthy ecosystem. That's one problem. We have a lot of existing ways of congressional oversight, of federal oversight, as well as state oversight, that have kind of been deactivated or not fully embraced over the last 4 decades. And those happen to be the 4 decades that the tech industry grew massively. It's just, grew up at a time when the political economy is sort of matched. It really favored the growth of tech, and also inculcated attitudes of, shouldn't pay much in taxes. I should, part of my innovative magic is that, the public sector has as little to do with me as possible. And actually, it always has been there. And we are not in 1996 anymore. We need an update.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people who think that the free market is the absence of government, and I often point out to my students, without government, there would be no such thing as a free market.
Exactly.
It constructs what we think of as a free market.
Absolutely, 100%.
So Starship Moon asks, what are your thoughts about the efforts to remove false information about the vaccines that are coming now? And when people are posting about their own lived experiences, and they get sometimes taken down. Is this a problem?
Gosh, it's yet another example of how that's so challenging. But I think that where that's a useful example of perhaps where content and the poster can be separated, right? So focusing perhaps on content of posts rather than the individual themselves is one way to address the problem, and the sheer volume of COVID misinformation or COVID vaccine information, all sorts. It's just been such a chaotic environment, and that misinformation has been proven to have has been detrimental. It's been detrimental to the societal response to the vaccine containing the virus, all those things. And so I think in that, again, these are private platforms and private companies. Like I would be distressed if one of my posts were taken down and I wasn't able to express something, but it's not my, that's not my constitutional right. Again, it's a private platform. And I have other venues to express that, or maybe not post at all. I think we've become a little too conditioned to just narrating our lives on these platforms. It's always going to be imperfect. I think this underscores how these platforms are designed for something else, and they are moving at a scale and a speed, and they're designed for virality. They're designed for things, I talk a lot about, the compare and contrast the early 19th century print culture in America, or 18th century, right? That gets us the American Revolution, Tom Paine and, all these broadsheets being distributed. Anyone can have with a printing press can, write something up and spread the word. And it also was a vehicle for a great deal of disinformation. It's a vehicle for kind of cacophony of voices and incredibly partisan speech, and sometimes slanderous speech. And I mean, you want to talk about nasty campaigns, like, welcome to 1800, man. Like, really. So, that again, I don't want to sort of excuse and wave it away, but we do have these, this became less chaotic for a reason. And I think in the case of the COVID response and vaccination, especially with such high levels of vaccine skepticism already, the more that I think it's within the right of the companies. They can do whatever they want. Section 230 lets them do that, and they're private companies. But I don't think I think we've overcorrected on kind of letting voices, letting everyone say their piece, and it has led to disinformation.
Yeah, that probably have time for one last question, and this is a good place for it. We have a viewer who asks, why is it that people who are using these platforms don't understand that they are agreeing to the rules and regulations that these companies have when they participate in the platforms? Is there something that can be done to rectify that?
Raise your hand if you've read the entire terms and conditions of any website that you sign up for. I have not. I just hit agree. Part of this is, part of it, yes, you could say we consumers need to be better. We need to be better users. We need to be better and recognize it. But also, it shouldn't be up to personal responsibility. I think one of the things that has been useful in the way that tech has, tech was sort of embraced pretty uncritically by so many for so long until pretty recently. And even though Silicon Valley moguls complain that reporters from the New York Times are mean to them, which I think is the tiniest of violins, nonetheless, I think there's a healthy dissection of how they work. And also when doing so, you realize how much they are designed, in ways that make us individuals it's very difficult to take yourself away from it, both in terms of they are designed to engage and addict us, also because they're pervasive. It's very, very hard you can say, okay, I'm going to delete Facebook, or I'm going to delete all my social media accounts. And that's one thing you can do, but your information is still out there, and the people that you're connected with in real life or online are, Facebook knows about you, even if you don't have an account with them. Or I don't want to just single out just Facebook, but that's obviously the 800-pound gorilla. But there's a real, it's very, very, so I think, yes, sure, we can be savvy consumers. I think being asked, those terms and conditions are that long for a reason. They're so we won't read them. So thinking about how you can make that information more transparent. And add more friction. That's something that the companies have been trying to do, make it a little slower to just post, do you want to read the article first before you share it, that sort of thing. Those are design things that can help, but those are fixes, not, we're looking at more fundamental things. And unfortunately, it's going to mean that these companies can't make the profits they've been making if you really, really wanted to tackle the problem. But the other thing consumers can do is they can, vote with their feet. But still, that's, a bunch of people deleting an app is not going to be the solution.
Yeah. Well, Professor O'Mara, I want to thank you very much for being with us at the Foley Institute today. You've given us a lot to think about.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Our pleasure. Let me also thank the audience for joining us today and remind you that our next event is the first in our distinguished lecture series on the constitutional crisis in America. That's with the renowned historian Eric Foner from Columbia University. That'll be next Tuesday at noon. So put that on your calendars, and I hope to see you all then. Thanks again for joining us today.